but at least they can weigh that in as they're trying to figure out how much weight to attach to his opinion. What the NBC executive said back to us is that they just didn't see that there was any need to make those kinds of disclosures. Now,
you interviewed the president of NBC News, Steve Kappas.
I did, yes. What I've learned since the story ran is that although they, for the most part, defended their use of General McCaffrey after the story on General McCaffrey ran, they have begun re-looking at their internal ethics policies, their standards and practices. And what I noticed in the last couple of months, I did see an appearance where General McCaffrey was on TV, and David Gregory, in fact, did tell viewers, okay, he sits on the board of DynCorp. And so there was at least a move toward a little bit more disclosure. But there's still this sort of deeper question of, there are a lot of retired military officers who have great expertise out there who, in fact, don't work for defense contractors who are over in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is this question of if a network wants to make use of that expertise and bring that to the table in their coverage, why not find somebody who doesn't have these outside entanglements to do that? And
I will point out that clip we just played was also after your piece. You say General McCaffrey, you quote Steve Kappas as saying that General McCaffrey is not required to abide by NBC's formal conflict of interest rules because he's a consultant, not a news employee.
That's the position they took. That's quite something. I mean, one thing that we did discover through the reporting of this is that the military analysts, many of them aren't just having an on-air role, but they're having an off-air role as well. They're, in some cases, participating in the editorial meetings where coverage of the war is being discussed. They're weighing in on story ideas. They're suggesting, in some cases, story ideas. And in some cases, they were suggesting story ideas that were suggested to them from the Pentagon. And so I think it's probably a little bit of a surprise for viewers who became so accustomed to seeing these generals as part of the news coverage to now be told, well, wait a minute, they're actually not considered journalists in any way, shape, or form, and they're consultants, and so therefore they're not beholden to any of our other ethical standards that would, for example, make it impossible for Tom Brokaw to go over and cover Iraq, but at the same time be representing a defense contractor seeking business in Iraq. If that were to happen, we all know that would be a huge scandal in journalism. But when it comes to these guys, those rules didn't apply.
Well, shortly after the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, Eason Jordan, then the chief news executive at CNN, admitted that CNN sought the Pentagon's approval of prospective CNN news analysts during the lead-up to the Iraq War.
I think it's important to have experts explain the war and to describe the military hardware, describe the tactics, talk about the strategy behind the conflict. I went to the Pentagon myself several times before the war started, met with important people there and said, for instance, at CNN, here are the generals we're thinking of retaining to advise us on the air and off about the war, and we got a big thumbs up on all of them. That was important.
Eason Jordan, your response, David Barstow.
Well, what was interesting was that what we saw during the process of the sort of the wooing, the cultivation of these generals, and it's important to note that some of them, during moments of the war, developed deep misgivings about what they were being told in these briefings. They began to suspect that they weren't really getting the straight truth, that they were getting a sort of, they were getting a sort of a rose-colored view of what was really happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yet, when those guys began to sort of go off the reservation and begin giving voice to those doubts on air, what we saw happen was that some of them found their access rather abruptly cut off. And so there was this effort on the part of the Pentagon to use access as the sort of the carrot and the stick. And access is a really important thing to focus in on here, because if you're in the world of defense contracting in Washington, access to people and to information is really the coin of the realm. It is so important to have that kind of granular, up-close, frequent contact with the very top people at the Pentagon to understand what are their needs, what are they thinking about next. And in some cases, you would see these guys go back out into the marketplace and advertise the special access they were getting as military analysts to people who they were trying to bring in as clients or as consulting arrangements or as board, to win a seat on a board of a company.
I was struck by your story of the description of General Marks, who became a CNN military analyst after his retirement in 2004, would be named the president of the new DynCorp subsidiary Global Linguist Solutions. General McCaffrey was chair of Global Linguist, and explain what it was and what happened with it.
Global Linguist was a company that was set up specifically to go after one of the biggest defense contracts that was let during the Iraq War. And it was a contract to supply many thousands of translators to the entire American military war effort in Iraq. General McCaffrey at some point became aware of the fact that the American generals in Iraq were not pleased with the performance of the company that held the contract, and that they were thinking about rebidding the contract. He then recruited General Marks to come in to be the president of this new subsidiary for DynCorp. And as you mentioned, General McCaffrey would be the chairman of this subsidiary. And that company then spent months fighting to win this contract that was worth over $4 billion. It was a contract that would have, when it was announced and when it was granted to Global Linguists, would actually send DynCorp's stock up 15% in one day. And so the two of them together were involved in this effort to win this contract. This is in really the latter part of 2006, right as the American public, if you recall, after the midterm elections, there was a huge moment of sort of internal national soul searching about what do we do with Iraq? Should we get in or get out of Iraq? This is when Jim Baker and his commission were weighing ideas about whether we should exit Iraq by March of 2008 or not. At that same time, General McCaffrey and General Marks and this company, Global Linguists, were locked in this battle for this $4 billion plus contract to supply all the translators in Iraq. And at the same time, they were going on television talking about, should we stay or should we go? Now, at the time, both of those guys took the position that we really needed to stay in Iraq and see it through. General McCaffrey especially was hugely critical of the Baker-Hamilton recommendation to pull out most of our combat troops by March of 2008. So there was this sort of confluence at that time of their business interests and what they were saying on air. What we don't know, it's important to note that not only were these relationships not disclosed to the viewers of either CNN or NBC, but CNN at least claimed that they weren't even aware that General Marks, their main military analyst, in fact had this role with this company, was deeply involved in fighting for this contract. And then, indeed, when they found out in mid-2007 or later on in 2007 that he, in fact, did play this role with his company, CNN pretty quickly severed its ties with General Marks, and he no longer appears on air as a military analyst for them. NBC, that's not the case.
December 18, 2006, Pentagon stuns Wall Street by awarding the translation contract to global linguist. DynCorp stock jumps 15%. And as you point out, according to a 2007 corporate filing, General McCaffrey was promised $10,000 a month plus expenses. Once global linguists secure the contract, he would also be eligible to share in profits, which could potentially be significant. The contract was worth $4.6 billion over 5 years, but only if the United States did not pull out of Iraq first.
That's right.
We're talking with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Barstow. We'll be back with him in a minute.